This video is part of Postmates College efforts to create neurodiversity-friendly classrooms. It's useful for anyone who works in the helping professions or anyone who wants to understand neurodivergent people better. We'll consider what neurodiversity is with particular attention to autism and ADHD. Neurodiversity as a term reflects the fact that not everyone's brains is the same, and neurodiversity as a model refers to how we as a society respond to this reality. We begin by acknowledging, here in the words of Harvard Health Publishing, that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. The neurodiversity model means that we don't believe there is one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving. So the word neurotypical is used in contrast to neurodivergent, but using the neurodiversity model, neurotypical doesn't mean normal, correct, or better. And the other thing that's part of this neurodiversity model is that unlike the medical descriptions of neurodivergent conditions, neurodiverse differences are not viewed as deficits. It's just the way people are. A book that might be useful for you in understanding neurodiversity is Steve Silverman's book, Neurotribes. I have borrowed this graphic to give you a sense of some of the conditions that fall under the neurodiversity umbrella. Notice in this graphic, the descriptors are not deficit-based. They are actually ascribing strengths to some of these conditions. In case you're wondering where autism falls on this, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the DSM, lists autism as ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, but on this graphic, it is ASC, Autism Spectrum Condition. Here is a list of some, but by no means all, conditions that would fall under the neurodiversity umbrella. This video is in particular going to talk about autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, and to a lesser extent, but particularly talking about prevalence, we'll discuss mood disorders a little bit. Autism is a neurological difference that affects, among other things, sensory processing, information processing, executive function, language, and social interaction. Let's look a little more in detail at executive functioning. Here I'm using the metaphor of the management system of the brain being like cogs and wheels in a gear system that runs smoothly. So executive function helps with tasks such as memory, self-control, flexible thinking, paying attention, organizing, planning and prioritizing, starting tasks and staying focused on them to completion, understanding different points of view, regulating emotions, self-monitoring, like keeping track of what you're doing. So these are just some of the things that executive function does. But for people with executive function disorder, those gears don't fit together the way that we might expect, not being managed by executive function, which means that all of these executive function tasks are so much harder to do than neurotypical people might expect. Now, because it's called an autism spectrum, some people think that it ranges from not autistic all the way through to very autistic, but that is not the case. So I have borrowed here from the artofautism.com an excellent image that helps explain a better spectrum model for autism. In this diagram, it's looking at these common skills affected by autism: language, motor skills, perception, executive function, and sensory processing. So one person's place on this spectrum could look like this, with strengths and weaknesses in different areas. Another person's might look more like this. Now, bear in mind that this does not vary merely from person to person, but can vary over time, including even in the space of 1 day or 1 hour.
My language processing skills might be really good in the morning, but by the afternoon, as my energy is depleted, or perhaps as I am more stressed, my language ability can completely be depleted so that I cannot form thoughts into words at all. One of the trouble that people have with invisible disabilities like autism, any of these neurodivergent conditions, is that, first of all, people assume that you can do things because they can't see that you can't, but they'll also assume that because you did something an hour ago, you will still be able to do it right now. And this is not the case with many disabilities. Medical practitioners and other professionals have in the past used functioning labels for conditions such as autism, like high functioning and low functioning. This was explained to me by one clinician as referring to IQ.
So a person with an intellectual disability would be called low functioning, and a person without an intellectual disability would be called high functioning.
This is not helpful. For one thing, it's stigmatizing, and for another thing, it implies that if you have high intelligence, you are able to overcome all of the disabilities that you have.
I'll let this meme explain it further.
There's no such thing as mild autism. For a person who is autistic, it's always spicy. You may wonder if there are some characteristics that could indicate that a person is autistic. So it turns out there might be. It is common for many autistic people to avoid eye contact. In fact, they may find it downright painful. It should be noted that a preference for eye contact is in fact culturally specific, and there are some cultures where eye contact is considered rude. So it is by no means abnormal for someone to not wish to look you in the eye when you're speaking to them. Stims are another often visible behavior that could indicate autism. STIMS stands for stimulating behavior, and in fact, this is something that all people do. Lots of neurotypical people will do things like, say, tap their fingers or their foot or click a pen. One form of a STIM that my picture represents is hand waving or hand flapping. Things like hair twirling, nail biting, touching something with a particular texture that is appealing. There's visual stims as well. There are oral stims. There could be verbal stims where making particular sounds or saying something in particular is helpful. So a stim helps with focus, with self-regulation. It's a very helpful behavior, and clinicians should not discourage it. Communication difficulty, as mentioned earlier, is something quite common with autism. While speech therapists have been able to help autistic people with some of their communication difficulties, the focus of speech therapy, at least in the United States, is very much on the mechanics of speech. And this is not necessarily what is causing difficulty for the autistic person. The ability to form thoughts into words could be one of the issues and is often not helped by conventional speech therapy. Now, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, characterizes autism as being marked by limited special interests. I think perhaps a better way to think about that is a passionate interest in some topics. These passionate interests can be very useful to an autistic person finding their path in life, and it's also a great way to connect on a personal level with an autistic person to express an interest in their passionate interests and let them talk about it. And then autism could be completely invisible. Autistic people and many people with differences mask to try to fit in, which actually uses up a lot of energy and can be draining, leading to meltdowns. So you can't necessarily tell that an autistic person is autistic.
There is no one profile for autistic people. Remember, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
I mentioned mentioned meltdown a moment ago, and I wanted to go into a little more detail about it. Meltdown is very common for autistic people, and it happens when they are overwhelmed, out of energy, too much stress, too much sensory input. There's a lot of reasons why it can happen. Meltdown means that their ability to function and control themselves has really been diminished. And it can look many different ways. It can look like a person has very much withdrawn, can't communicate. It could manifest as angry outbursts. But the important thing to understand is that the individual is not in control of their behavior at the time, and they really need to be left alone to recover without demands or inputs. So understanding is very helpful for autistic people in meltdown. Please be aware that it can be very embarrassing for them that they're in this situation where they can't control their behavior. So as much as possible, respect them and give them the time and quiet they need to get themselves regulated again. And let's take a moment to consider autistic burnout, which is a little bit different than what we talk about with burnout from stress in the general population. So, in fact, autistic burnout can resemble a lot a major depressive episode, where someone is just unable to do basic things of self-care and getting through life for a particular stretch of time. One of the big differences between a depressive episode and autistic burnout is that for autistic people, burnout can be eased by re-energizing through engagement with preferred activities. Perhaps that's reading, maybe it's doing a craft. There's all kinds of different preferred activities that an autistic person can have. Burnout can last a significant amount of time. Could, for example, mean stress leave from a job for an individual, and they may need assistance in taking care of themselves until they're feeling like themselves again. Turning our attention to ADHD, also known as Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, the DSM classifies two kinds, the inattentive type and the impulsive type, and some lucky individuals have both.
Like autism, ADHD is a neurological disability affecting planning, focus, task initiation and task completion, and executive function. ADHD is not a behavior disorder, it's not a mental illness, nor is it a specific learning disability. It's a developmental impairment of the brain's self-management system, the executive dysfunction that we discussed earlier. ADHD characteristics could include inattention, poor time management, weak impulse control, losing things, trouble following instructions, exaggerated emotions, hyperfocus. This is the opposite of inattention and can exist just as much with ADHD, and hyperactivity. Autism and ADHD used to be considered childhood conditions, or at least it was only treated in childhood and people forgot about the needs of adults with these conditions. But they are both lifelong, and recent polls that I've read suggest that symptoms can get worse as you get older. It doesn't just go away. Both are more often diagnosed in males, 4-to-1 for autism and 2-to-1 for ADHD. However, this could be due to better social masking in both females and adults. And also it's something to note that autistic people seem to possibly be more likely to be non-binary than the general population. Both of these conditions occur in all racial and ethnic groups. And yet, it's more likely to be undiagnosed or treated as behavioral problems for people who are members of historically marginalized communities. There is a genetic factor to these. They are not caused by vaccines, too much sugar, red dye, video games, laziness, or poor or distant parenting. There are many frequently occurring conditions for both autism and ADHD. There's some that overlap them. Indeed, autism and ADHD frequently go together. Mood disorders such as depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder can be part of these conditions, and particularly with ADHD, substance abuse is more common. One of the reasons for this is that people might be self-medicating with the substance abuse. Sleep-wake disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and others are also frequently co-occurring conditions. I'd like to show you some of the estimates for the prevalence of some of these neurodivergences in the United States. You want to be careful looking at these because, well, they're kind of a moving target. These figures typically refer to people receiving treatment for these conditions in any one given year. Some of these figures are coming from the Centers for Disease Control and some from the National Institute of Mental Health. Depression figures represent current and over a lifetime. That's the spread there from 10 to 20%. I want to point out that there are 8 kinds of anxiety disorders included in this. That's panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, specific phobias, social anxiety disorder, which would be social phobia, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder can be included in that, and separation anxiety disorder. Gives us a little snapshot about the current estimated prevalence of autism in the United States. This graphic, borrowed from Autism Parenting magazine, shows us the increase in the estimate of prevalence over the last 20 years or so. So the last figure we had in this was from 2018, which is 1 in 44. Reasons for this increasing, actually a lot of it has to do with the changing of the criteria in the DSM. And I'd like to point out that the criteria used to be very much from an outsider or clinician's perspective, someone looking at, observing the autistic person. I do feel that the criteria now is a little bit more based on what it feels like to be autistic. So better diagnostic conditions, more awareness, and note this is from Autism Parenting magazine. Well, parents of people diagnosed with autism may start to notice that some of those criteria could apply to them. Remember, it's a genetic condition. And so as people become aware of those in their lives having diagnoses of autism, they may start to realize that that applies to them as well. Here I'd like to take a look at a graph, and yes, this is a little bit out of date, but it did come from the National Institute of Health in the United States, and it is showing the lifetime prevalence of mood disorders among adolescents in particular. So that means by the ages shown on the right, have they ever experienced a mental disorder? And you can see that by the end of childhood, more than 50% of people have experienced a mental health disorder. So with a lifetime prevalence of any mental health disorder being more than 50%, somehow the most common reported prevalence of neurodiversity you can find on the internet right now, including from the National Institute of Health, is 20%, seems to be leaving something out. If more than half the population will experience a neurodivergent condition in their life, maybe neurotypicality isn't as typical as we're assuming. So looking at difficulties that people might have, I'm specifically considering autism and ADHD here, but many of these apply to several other neurodivergencies. As discussed earlier, organization is a frequent difficulty. Movement, fine and gross motor skills, otherwise known as dyspraxia, can be an issue. As discussed, communication can be challenging. Picking up on cues of people around them and understanding what to do based on those cues is an area of difficulty. Time management is a concern. Waiting can be particularly challenging. People may have difficulties with sensory inputs, either things that are too high of a sensory input or too low. Self-regulation is a challenge. And understanding social rules and interactions can be quite difficult. So how can we address those needs? Clear and specific communication is really helpful. Don't make people read between the lines or pick up on subtle clues. Be direct. It may be helpful to provide high sensory input when desired by the person. And of course, also providing them with low sensory times as needed. Downtime and alone time is very helpful for recharging. And part of that, allow people to take breaks when they're overwhelmed. Give them opportunities for movement to help with self-regulation. Provide assistance with time management. Make sure that you give people processing time to fully understand any instructions, information, or tasks that you're giving them. And above all, give your understanding. Something important that I learned in my educational training is to assume that someone can't do something rather than they won't. Find and remove barriers that make a task impossible for someone. In addition to the resources mentioned on specific slides, here are some other places that you could go to get more information on neurodiversity, autism, and ADHD. Embrace Autism in particular is a great site if someone is looking for screening tools that they can use for themselves.